detecting gravity waves to verify inflation. Where does polarization fit into this? And why does detecting gravity waves, why would that have verified inflation? What I'm aiming towards is your baby bicep, which I'd really like to get to.
So in 1997 or 8 or so, well, let me take a step back. In the early 80s, there were many physicists who speculated on the properties of the cosmic microwave background, which had only been recently detected in 1965, and whose spectral properties, which are the easiest to measure because it's much easier to measure something that's 3 Kelvin, as hard as that is to measure, and something that's a millionth of a Kelvin, like the polarization or anisotropy of the microwave. And immediately in the discovery announcement of Penzias and Wilson in 1965, they announced to their level of sensitivity the CMB radiation, which bathes us in all directions as if we're inside of an oven, because in the sense we are. Luckily, that oven is only 3 Kelvin. And that is a consequence of the aftermath of the formation of the first atoms, which formed. There were searches in that very paper in 1965, which was only like one-page paper, which might be the shortest ratio of Nobel Prize to paper length, and they ended up stating that to their sensitivity, they could not discern any anisotropy. In other words, it looked perfectly homogeneous isotropic, nor could they discern any polarization. And that's because the properties of a distribution of photons only has three properties. It has a characteristic spectrum, it has its isotropy or smoothness as viewed in angle, and it has its polarization. Those are the three properties of an electromagnetic wave: frequency, intensity as a function of position, and polarization. That's it. Every other fungible property is completely interchangeable.
Since the polarization of light hasn't come up on the show before, I think it would be worth, since it's going to be very important in a few minutes, just explaining what this is.
Yes. So light has three properties. It's a spectrum. It's a rainbow of colors. It's intensity as a function of wavelength. It has its overall magnitude or amplitude of its intensity, how strongly oscillating is the electromagnetic field in a given direction at a given wavelength. And then the direction in which the electromagnetic field oscillates is called its polarization.
Hmm.
And in fact, it's the electric field. So the electric field determines the polarization. It's just like two people swinging a rope back and forth in a jump rope. The plane that the wave is oscillating in, the rope is oscillating, is called its polarization.
Okay, great.
So, and whenever light, polarized or not, interacts with matter, any kind of matter, there is a probability, in fact, of that light becoming more or less polarized. So if you have a 0% polarized object, like the sun is a pure black body. It's highly anisotropic, that's only in one half a degree wide spot on the sky. But the light is coming as if it's a perfectly random Brownian distribution, almost of the direction of photon oscillation passes, 100% unpolarized. And yet, if you have the resources, you should always buy polarized sunglasses. Why? Why should you buy polarized sunglasses if the sun is unpolarized? Well, that's because the sunlight that we see is not only coming directly from the sun, and take it from me as your friendly neighborhood astrophysicist, do not look at the sun with your remaining good eye. But when sunlight bounces off the surface of the ocean or off another dielectric like the ground or a road, it becomes partially and sometimes completely polarized. By suppression, there are only two polarization states of light: vertical, where the plane is oscillating vertically, or horizontally. And then every other combination could be a superposition of some amount of vertical, some amount of horizontal. You can get any angle of any plane of polarization you like. But unpolarized light is completely without any given direction. But when it interacts with the ocean or the land, it becomes possibly highly polarized. That allows your sunglasses to block with a filter, like a picket fence that only allows one direction of light to come through. And in the case of sunglasses, it will be vertically polarized to block, because the light that's getting scattered will be primarily horizontally polarized. So you'll be able to see through the surface of the ocean or the lake or whatever that you're fishing. So polarization results from the interaction of unpolarized light with matter. So now go back to the early universe. There wasn't an
Hmm.
ocean, there wasn't a pond, there wasn't a road, but there was a lot of matter in the form of electrons. Those electrons were present from the earliest phases of the Big Bang. And in fact, there are protons present too, and they only combined together to make the first atoms 380,000 years after the Big Bang. That's called recombination, and that's when the CMB is produced. And so the light of the CMB can be partially polarized. It's actually very weakly polarized, but it's polarized because the light that was present, that was unpolarized heat, interacted with matter that had an anisotropic distribution. So the polarization we see, it results from the imperfections in the distribution of matter and the properties of the earliest light left over from the fusion of the first electrons and protons to make hydrogen. That process can be influenced, the anisotropic imprinting in the early matter plasma can be accomplished in many ways. One of which is if there was a background at that time of gravitational radiation, gravitational waves.
Hmm.
The term gravity waves should be deprecated. That as a specific connotation in the theory of fluid mechanics. I don't care if you use it. I sometimes will use it, but a real persnickety professor on your candidacy exam might say, hold on, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He called the gravitational wave the gravity wave. Be that as it may. Gravitational radiation, if it's present at the earliest moments of our universe's fusion of the elements to make the first atoms, that process will imprint an anisotropy in the primordial plasma, which has a telltale pattern when observed today, one that we call B-mode polarization. I realized, thanks to the work of collaborators like Matthias Zaldariaga and Uros Seljak, and folks like Mark Kamiankowski, Arthur Kozowski, and others, that there would be a specific pattern that could be measurable. And this all dates back actually to a Russian colleague and mentor of mine named Alex Polnarev in the 1980s, who predicted what a single wave of gravity, gravitational wave, would do to the polarization of the cosmic microwave background. Then this was updated, modernized, translated into language an experimentalist can understand and search for. And I realized that the technology had come a long way by the year 2000 that we could finally build a camera, a telescope of a Galilean sort dedicated to measuring the specific telltale fingerprint of gravitational waves. Where do the gravitational waves come from? There's only one way that we believe we can get a stochastic random background of gravitational waves, and that's if the universe had a period of exponential inflation prior to the formation of the elements and their nuclei. And that's called inflation.
Hmm. So then, just to reiterate, and in a simplified fashion, if you could detect B-mode polarization in the CMB, that would indicate the existence of primordial gravity waves in the early universe at the time of inflation, and that would get a Nobel Prize.
That syllogism is about as good as I've ever heard it described.
Okay, perfect. So then, I think if I'm not mistaken, you came up with the idea for BICEP when you were at Stanford, or did it come out of some ideas from your time at Brown?
Well, my thesis at Brown was to build a microwave telescope that could only see the largest possible scales on the sky. Its resolution is very coarse. It was actually made from discarded parts from the COBE experiment that John Mather and George Smoot had graciously loaned or given to my grand advisor, David Wilkinson, who gave to my advisor, Peter Timby. And then we built this radiometer out of the spare parts of an instrument that would later win a Nobel Prize, basically. So that pedigree is kind of cool. So I built that instrument. Then I was hired to work on a different project at Stanford by Professor Sarah Church, who's still there. And she is in the physics department, and she was a brand new first year assistant professor there. And she hired me to work on specific telescope in Hawaii, and then to start building parts for a telescope in Bishop, California, Owens Valley, and other things. And I was, quite frankly, a pretty bad employee. I was prone to distraction, to look up things that was more interesting intellectually to me than working on what she wanted and hired me to work on. To give myself some solace, or perhaps to give myself some flexibility or opportunity for repentance. I was making $32,000 a year, which is probably less than you make. It was 1999, the height of the dot-com boom. I lived on the train tracks near Alma Street up there. And every 15 minutes, a Caltrain would go by from 5 a.m. to 1 in the morning, shuttling folks between the Bay Area and the Silicon Valley up to San Francisco, where all the startups were. So I was going on very little sleep. I was a very much disagreeable. And like I said, I was a pretty poor employee. But the one thing that kept me up was I wanted to do these really big, swing for the fences. And the projects I was working on with Professor Church were, in my opinion, very interesting, very important, but they weren't going to break the ground of discovery of something akin to discovering what caused the Big Bang to bang. And so I was fascinated by that. I had read a paper by my friend and later colleague, Mark Kamienowski, and Arthur Kozlowski, and Andrew Jaffe, and others, making note of a very simple fact. They made a note of it, but they didn't realize the implications, I don't think. They basically showed that the size of a telescope was almost irrelevant in terms of its sensitivity to waves of gravity, which would then probe inflation. And at that time, as is the case now, astronomers have what's called aperture fever. Since I was 12 years old and got my first telescope, I've always wanted my next telescope. And as they've rumored, to say, I think J.P. Morgan was once asked, how much money should a person strive for? And he said something like, just a little bit more. And astronomers feel that way about their telescopes. How big should your telescope be? Just a little bit bigger. And so there was like an arms race of building ever increasing telescopes. In fact, there was a plan to build a telescope at the South Pole. Now, be 10 meters in diameter. My telescope that I built for my PhD thesis was 10 centimeters in diameter. And the telescope's collecting power scales as the area of the telescope aperture, but its cost scales as the volume, the cube of the aperture diameter. So these telescopes are getting to be just incredibly expensive. And I thought, well, if you wanted to build a very nimble instrument that was only capable of seeing waves of gravity from the incipient inflationary birth pangs of the Big Bang, you would need only a telescope about 1 foot or 2 feet in diameter, which is basically free. And so I spent most of my time thinking about that instead of doing what Professor Church rightfully expected of me. And so one day, it was actually precipitated by the visit by Jill Tarter, who is still a friend and a mentor to me and millions around the world, at the SETI Institute at the time. She came to give a talk. I asked Sarah Church to get me an invitation to go see her at the colloquium dinner. And Sarah told me it's not my job to get dinner for my postdocs. And I always remember thinking, well, all right, she's on to me. She's seen I'm a slacker. I'm not doing what she wants me to do. And then soon thereafter, I was fired. She actually said, I don't think we have a place for you here anymore. We want you to leave. I want you to leave. But she did me, perhaps the greatest favor in my history, which is that she arranged an interview for me with one of the most magnanimous personalities in all of cosmology, Professor Andrew Lang at Caltech. And he was a legend already in the time. He was tall, dark, handsome, incredibly successful, had been stolen from Berkeley at great cost. He recruited his superstar wife, Frances Arnold, partner. She would go on to win the Nobel Prize in 2018 in chemistry. They were the power couple of all power couples. And he was gracious enough. He invited me down to give a seminar, and I did, and he offered me a job. And, before he finished the sentence, I accepted it, because to work for him meant, that I would be, changing locations, changing situations, getting out of a place where I wasn't wanted anyway, rightfully so. And so I moved down to Pasadena. And as soon as I arrived in Pasadena, I kept pushing this idea of building this instrument to Andrew Lang and my friend Jamie Bach, who's currently a professor at Caltech. And Jamie and I would play tennis every Wednesday night, rather. And one day I just kind of mentioned it to him. He thought, what are you working on? I said, I have this idea. We could build a very small telescope that could actually be the first dedicated instrument to measure inflationary gravitational. And he said, oh, that's interesting. And he brought it to Andrew, and Andrew basically said, let's do it. And so we applied for money. David Baltimore was the president of Caltech. He had $1 million discretionary fund. He gave it to Andrew and Jamie and I. We started building BICEP. The first instance of BICEP, which would be a telescope located at the South Pole, a refracting Galilean telescope that could only measure waves of gravity. And in fact, in 2014, we claimed that we did measure those waves of gravity with a successor instrument called BICEP-2, which is just like your iPhone 15. It just has more pixels, it has higher sensitivity, but the same basic idea as the iPhone 14. BICEP-2 is basically essentially the same cryostat, same location, same optics design, but with better, more sensitive and more detectors. And so we claimed in March of 2014 that we had measured the imprimatur of inflation, these B-mode polarization pattern, uniquely indicative of gravitational radiation itself, as you summarized so beautifully, indicative of evidence for, not proof, but at least very strong circumstantial evidence for inflation.